Welcome to the AI for Good interview series, in which we discuss the opportunities and challenges presented by artificial intelligence development with some of the leading voices working in the field today. Our guest for this episode is Kay Firth-Butterfield, the head of artificial intelligence and machine learning for the World Economic Forum and a co-founder of the Consortium for Law and Policy of Artificial Intelligence and Robotics at the Robert E. Strauss Center, University of Texas. At the World Economic Forum, Kay plays a key role in shaping dialogue between political, academic, and nonprofit leaders on the ethical use and deployment of AI technology. In the discussion that follows, James Hodson, Chief Executive Officer of the AI for Good Foundation, talks with Kay about topics such as national strategies and incentive models for AI development, the role of partnerships in deploying new technologies to address the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and the need to promote robust diversity among AI developers to ensure a plurality of perspectives.
So maybe we just begin by you describing some of the AI-related projects that you're actively working on at the World Economic Forum, specifically things that have a relationship with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. I'm sure there are many things given that it's the World Economic Forum.
Yes, definitely. I think that the place to start is really thinking about AI national strategies. So at the moment, only 27 countries have an AI national strategy. That's obviously going to go up because the European Commission has mandated European countries to actually create an AI strategy. But why do I say that this is an important piece of work we're doing? What we're doing is writing a piece that will enable countries to think about the elements of creating a national AI strategy. And to me, that's really important because if you're going to try and look at doing anything with AI as a government or indeed a company for that matter, then you really need to have a plan about how you're going to be utilizing this technology in your country. And so once you have that plan in place, then you can think about how you would utilize the technology to, for example, cure some of the Sustainable Development Goals. So if you look, for example, at the work that we're doing with the Indian government does have a national AI strategy, and now it's looking at creating a data marketplace for AI so that more indigenous Indian companies can actually become AI companies, and that will improve the economics of the country, but also of many of their citizens as they start to create businesses around using AI and use AI. A good example of that is the fact that India mapped all of their agricultural fields. And if you put that together with IoT and drones, and then run AI over it, you're going to get a much better idea of the sort of things that farmers could or should be planting and how to maintain those crops. So immediately you begin to deal with the poverty issue, Sustainable Development Goal, and of course the hunger one as well.
That's actually a very interesting point to go down. So it sounds like what you're saying is that at the country level, once we get a framework in place by which we can think about AI development in the context of the local economy, then we can start to think about the SDGs. What are some of the cornerstones? And you mentioned the economic empowerment and getting more of the economic activity, entrepreneurial activity, innovation capabilities of a country going towards this area. What are some of the other cornerstones of having a plan for a country for AI development?
Well, I think that partnerships for the goals, if you've got a strategy in place, then you can look for the right partners in these emerging technologies to be able to help you to meet some of the SDGs. We also have another project that we are at the moment very much in the landscaping phase of. But as you may well know, industrial waste accounts for 98.6% of the world's waste. We are hoping that we can look at reducing that waste through the good offices of using AI. that begins to hit some of the SDGs. If we could just reduce that level by 2%, it would be important for the planet. But if we reduced it by a great deal more, then obviously that would be even more important for our world.
I guess we can move on to the next angle, which is what is the biggest misconception that you encounter regarding what AI can do for the welfare of society, and what are the realities that you try to explain?
I think that the biggest misconception around AI at the moment is that we are busily using it for the benefit of society. I'm not sure that we are as advanced in using it for the benefit of society, by which I mean meeting the Sustainable Development Goals as we would like to be. A lot of AI development tends to be around selling things, places where those who develop AI are going to get most rewarded. And in this regard, I very much like the way that Mustafa Suleiman, who is one of the founders of DeepMind, puts it, that it's a great shame that many of the brightest minds in AI are at the moment working on selling more soft drinks as opposed to goal 6, clean water and sanitation.
That's one of the unfortunate parts of the economic system that we live within, where we generate value in an economy is not always where in those activities that would lead it to be a better place for people. Do you think that we're going in the right direction in terms of giving more opportunities to people who want to have an impact? I'll give you, the reason why I ask that follow-on question, because I have a lot of conversations with top researchers in the field of AI at the best universities in the world, and they're also working on recommender engines and on essentially identifying better ways to target people with advertisements. And it's not that they don't want to work on sanitation, but it's just the incentive systems are set up and the funding schemes are set up in such a way that it's much harder for them to work on the problems that are important social challenges, whereas it's very easy for them to get a faculty grant that is maybe not related to the goals.
Well, I'm not saying that we shouldn't obviously create an economy using AI, but I am saying that it would be beneficial to the world if we could also have capital put into companies that really want to try to do good with the AI, when I define doing good as meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. And I don't think that the two have to be mutually exclusive, because goal 1 is no poverty. Well, that actually means injecting something into the economy of a country so that you can relieve the poverty. So, there are definitely business aspects to the use of AI that could also help with Sustainable Development Goals.
I think that there is a great potential in terms of being able to build business models that have sustainable social impact and environmental impact as the main core and as profitable businesses. And I think that that should be one of the main thrusts in terms of how we go about building solutions to these enormous challenges that we've set ourselves by 2030. Many of which we probably won't achieve in a significant sense, but that it's good enough that we try our best to achieve them. Do you think that's right? Do you think that you already said that we do need to put more capital into this, but do you think that that can be one of the main drivers for solving these problems?
Yes, I think that what we need to be doing is to think about careful deployment of artificial intelligence in a way that then creates benefit to the country or citizen or businesses within those, or probably all of them. So let me give you an example. Today I was just at the Center for Humane Tech, their launch of their new strategy. They were saying that it's really important that we think about what it means to be human and how some of these technologies, particularly AI, can drive us as human beings to behave in certain ways. So one of the things that I tend to like to concentrate on is we need to, when we're framing success under the Sustainable Development Goals using AI, we need to be able to recognize that not all AI is beneficial. There are some difficult pieces of AI. And so if I think about Sustainable Development Goal 3, good health and well-being, one thing that may be open to startups around the world would be some forms of precision medicine, collecting data about systems so that we can use AI for better diagnosis. That seems to me to be a great possibility for meeting that particular goal. But we also, when we're doing that, need to be really careful that when we're nudging citizens into perhaps eating more responsibly or perhaps going to the doctor more often or learning more about their health or whatever it is, we're not at the same time manipulating them into doing things. And so I think it's important that we build some firm foundations around how we see AI and how we grow AI, because otherwise we might end up solving some of these goals and actually opening some other problems for ourselves.
AI is basically a Swiss Army knife, right? And you can choose how you want to use it. But if you don't really understand the problem that you're solving or the repercussions of how you try to solve it, then you will have unwanted consequences. And of course, that's something that's especially pertinent when you're working with individual level, highly sensitive data, especially health data or behavioral data, where we need to make sure we're protecting kind of both access to that, but also ensuring, as you said, that we don't essentially build highly tailored recommender engines that do the same thing as news polarization and political polarization is doing in social media, but on a health level, which could be disastrous.
Yes, absolutely, which is why I say I think that it's really important that we put in some firm foundations around deployment. If I think of quality of education, I believe that if we could educate everybody to a good standard, we would increase everyone's economic status. Whether we make everybody happier is maybe a different matter, I don't know. But the issue here with education is we don't know how human beings will respond to being educated by AI. We also need to have some clear foundations about what they are going to be taught. So what's the curricula and who is in charge of that curricula? We need to have some clear guidelines as to how the child's data is going to be managed, because it would perhaps be wrong for that child's data to be monetized and shared. And also, if you think of a very young child, their minds are very plastic. And so if we don't put in good protections, then it would be possible for bad actors to perhaps influence them to make them lifelong voters in one way or another. So we have a project at the forum which is being undertaken with UNICEF to really drill down on the fundamentals we need to put into place to ensure that when we do move to education using AI, we have got all these questions answered rather than just going full on to deployment and then trying to work out how we then put things right for arguably the most vulnerable population in the world.
Well, while we're on the question of deployment, maybe we can switch to talking about what some of the near-term impacts might be, or moreover, the areas or the sustainable development goals where you think AI can have the biggest beneficial breakthroughs in the next handful of years, so in the real immediate future. Do you think there's an area in particular where we can have a big breakthrough on the SDGs?
I suspect that you're going to see it perhaps in SDG 11, Sustainable Cities and Communities, because there's a growing movement, and I say this is AI, but others might say this is IoT, in the smart cities innovation. I would say it's AI because IoT devices simply collect the data, but that's not much use to you without running AI over it. So I think that we're definitely going to see emergence of a lot more smart city tech around the world. And as you know, China, for example, is building an entire new city, as is Saudi Arabia, just to experiment on this smart city idea. And there are a lot of countries that are involved in that. I think we'll probably see some AI in innovation and so 9, industry, innovation, and infrastructure. Interestingly, with some new technologies, you're not necessarily thinking about upgrading infrastructure because, for example, if you're using drones to deliver things, then you don't necessarily need to spend the money on traditional road infrastructure.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So, as you mentioned, industry, what the Germans would call Industry 4.0 and kind of the next industrial revolution. I'm thinking about Africa, which is a huge continent, and it's also the continent undergoing the highest population growth that we've ever seen in the history of the world. And we're anticipating 1 billion new people over the next couple of decades will be born there and require education. But also to take that to its logical extreme, and the kinds of conversations that are happening now are we able to efficiently educate those people? And are we able to help those people to become efficient economic actors in order to build an African industry, an industrial complex that's able to sustain that continent long term without a humanitarian crisis that might otherwise affect the entire world? So, as you mentioned, the industrial applications here, do you think that we can use that in the African context to help move things in the right direction there?
Well, there is no doubt that some African countries have already reached out to us at the forum to start working on thinking about these issues. So we just signed a partnership with South Africa, where we will be working on AI with the government of South Africa to really drill down deeply on these questions that you've just asked me. So I don't immediately have the answer, but I hope to as we begin to work with our African partners. We also have a partnership with the government of Rwanda, where my drones example came from. So, and I think the drones example is not specifically AI, but I think it's a great example. The company that really cut its teeth in providing drones in Rwanda was a company from the west coast of America called Zipline. And with the team from the forum and from the Rwandan government, the various regulations were put in place to allow drone movement, free movement of drones in Rwandan airspace. And what's really interesting out of that is that a lot of other countries around the world have now looked at those regulations with a view to adopting them. And Zipline actually was able to grow its business in Africa rather than here on the West Coast. And so maybe that's an indication of the future to come for Africa.
Thanks again. That's a really nice example, I think, of how you can build those networks with for-profit motives, but that have a broader impact. But how do we ensure actually that this knowledge sharing happens on a global level? Often I see it being still stuck so that the expertise don't necessarily make it across borders.
Yeah, we certainly do. And again, if we go back to Rwanda, I know that they are working on developing a strategy to ensure the education of Rwandans in artificial intelligence. And really, I'm a great believer that we need to try and grow the AI talent in countries in Africa for them to really have the full benefit of AI use. And obviously, we also need to think about the collection and storage of data as well, because a lot of the models that we've been using in Europe and States don't convert for Africans.
Once again, the data question is something that I think is getting a lot of attention, but is still far from having perfect solutions, right? Especially across different industry sectors. So I wonder then, what do you think are some critical areas of AI development today that you believe are underfunded or underdeveloped? Maybe the AI community, if they focused on these particular areas, whether that's reasoning and symbolic learning or particular types of graphical models, or whether it's just thinking about artificial intelligence and integration into robotics or IoT, as you mentioned earlier, do you think that there are areas that we should be focusing on that maybe we're not?
I think that the area that probably needs more funding is the integration of robotics and AI, mainly because a lot of the challenges that we have with creating good robots are proving to be quite intractable. And so if I think of the sort of things that we're going to need, we've been talking about sustainable development goals, but I think it's also important to think about places like Europe and Japan, for example, where there is a strong likelihood that we will have a lot of elderly people living a long time, and the need to balance the economy by enabling those people to live longer and more fulfilled lives, then I think the development of better robots is going to be key for that, but also key for helping to deal with some of the sustainable development goals in terms of providing more teachers, for example. Often in African classrooms, you hear about sort of one teacher to 120 children, all of different ages. Well, maybe if we had a sympathetic robot loaded with AI, we would have more teachers in that setting.
That's a very good point. I'm glad that you bring that up. And I also think that it's an area where finally, after several decades of them growing apart as academic disciplines, now there's a real opportunity to find synergies and solve problems that are classically control problems for robotics with AI, but also perhaps to bring back some of the symbolic area of AI that's been lost over the past 20 years or so into machine learning research and kind of knowledge management side of things, which is also important for the way that we think about the technology.
I agree enormously with that. And just as an example of bringing these two disciplines together, we at the forum have just created this Global AI Council, which will meet for the first time on the 29th of May here in San Francisco. And the idea of that council is to think about some of the global challenges with AI and see whether, because we've brought together people from across the globe, we can't make a difference in those areas. But one of our council members is a gentleman called Dr. Alan Winfield. He has just retired from being head of a robotics lab, which is the largest in Europe. And on the other side, he has been leading some of the work that we've been doing at the IEEE around the global initiative on ethical design of intelligent and autonomous systems, and recently had some work published in Nature looking at the ethical dilemmas of AI. And so there you have somebody embodying the two disciplines together.
Now, kind of curious now that we've touched a few areas, and I feel like we've been using the term artificial intelligence very loosely, and maybe it would be good for those listening to this interview to kind of hear what you think artificial intelligence actually stands for. It seems to be used as a catch-all term. One of the ways that some people have put it is that it's AI until it works. So anything that we don't yet really have working, that's more of a pipe dream, is artificial intelligence. As soon as we deploy it, it stops being artificial intelligence. What do you think is the right way for us to frame the way we think about AI and what it encompasses in terms of sustainability and, but maybe even broader than that?
I agree that, we use this term AI in a way that means that we don't then have to define what we're thinking of behind it. But really at the moment, and, without going back to the work that was done before, we're really looking at forms of machine learning. And I think that it's important that we keep talking about artificial intelligence because that's how the public understands it. The public's probably not going to understand the difference between facial recognition technology or natural language processing or any of the other pieces that make up AI. And because I think that the conversation that we need to have very urgently at the moment is with the general public about how they want to see AI deployed, then I'm content to keep using the term AI. But of course, when I use the term AI, I don't mean to suggest that we're near AGI, although I understand the guys at OpenAI in the interview that they did with The Verge said that we're closer than they had ever thought before.
I think they're doing fantastic work, but I think they often mix up the reality between optimizing over constraints that you understand already and actually deploying usable, functional things in the real world. But that's a conversation for another time, I guess. But that's a very useful way of thinking about AI, kind of within the public realm. Although I would maybe add to that, perhaps we also have a responsibility to educate the general public.
I agree with you that we need better education just generally about this topic. And we need to have a conversation between those of us who understand a little bit more about the technology and people who don't. I'm quite concerned that we might lose the benefits of AI that we've been discussing and the possibilities of looking at all these SDGs in a different way using the technology if we don't actually have a robust conversation about it.
Absolutely. So I guess to pull everything together, right, we've talked about various ways in which AI is already having an impact today. We've talked about some ways in which it might have an impact in the future. We've touched on some of the risks and obviously a lot of the benefit that can come from appropriate and judicious application of these technologies. But clearly, and as we started from the conversation about the country level discussions about a framework for AI development, do you see, what do you see as the right type of governance entity? Because clearly, just like we have professional societies for computer science and, other engineering disciplines, we also very much likely will need a society or some entity that helps to guide us in our deployment and development of artificial intelligence technology. But what do you think is the right type of governance entity in a world where that kind of development is accelerating very, very quickly and often is dominated by very, very large firms with enormous economic leverage, but maybe not always operating in the best interests of the people at large?
Here at the forum, what we are thinking of is processes that could be put in place around what we call agile governance. And I think that really covers all sorts of things from standards to certification to self-regulation amongst companies, right through to regulation in the traditional form by government. But what we've been trying to do is to recognize that certainly with a lot of these technologies, regulation is really too late because by the time a country's got round to regulating, the whole construct that they were regulating has moved on. And to give you an example of the sort of thing that we were working on, two examples. One is working with professors of artificial intelligence to ensure that they build into their curricula a sort of social justice element to the curricula. So they're not just training people to be able to be AI scientists, they're training students to be AI scientists who also understand the impact for good and ill that their creations may have. And so that's a sort of soft governance measure. We are also working with, as anchor partner, the British government, but actually we have, I think it's 8 other countries now who want to pilot this work, where we are putting together guidelines against which the UK government will procure artificial intelligence. So, for example, if they want to procure an application that they're going to, with AI in it, that they're going to use in the National Health Service, the application would have to meet these standards set out in these guidelines that we're working on at the moment in a multi-stakeholder way.
Very interesting. I'm sure that we definitely look forward to seeing what comes out of that. It sounds like it could be a very impactful guideline set.
So, if you think about it, it's the government wanting to draw a line in the sand and say, this is the type of artificial intelligence we want created in our country. But also it's helping businesses, because businesses will say, okay, we know where we stand and what's expected of us. And, there's a benefit to the startup and business community as well as to the government and the citizens.
I couldn't agree more with the benefits of appropriate communication between government entities, which spend hundreds of billions of dollars each year to procure and deploy technology that's meant to be for the good of their populations, and most of the time is for the good of their populations, and the companies that have the ability to meet those requirements. It has a huge impact on economic value creation potential in a country when you can align those. Again, I want to stress how happy we are that we're able to have this conversation. I think it's really important that we're able to build these bridges and keep the lines of communication open among different organizations that are working on these challenges, which is one of the things that we care a lot about at the Foundation, about building networks of excellence that will help bring best practices across these problems, whether it's at the governmental country level, whether it's at the grassroots level, or through other international cooperation mechanisms. And clearly, few people who are as perfectly placed as yourself to give a perspective on all of this. I do have one quick additional question, more around, there was a World Economic Forum, a note on gender equality. And it said that for the first time in something like, or since they started to measure this at World Economic Forum, that for the first time in 2018, the measure of gender equality decreased. So globally, however it's measured, and I did look into it and it seemed fairly reasonable, gender equality got worse in 2018 for the first time ever. And especially in the engineering and computer science disciplines and in artificial intelligence, even in particular out of these disciplines, we still struggle to get enough female engineers into leadership positions to bring innovative strength to the fabric of what we're doing, even though it's been shown to be positive in every possible way on every possible measure. How do we do better at this? I mean, you see this probably from the inside in the work that you do. This is, to me, one of the biggest challenges that we have also is, and of course there are many variables at play, but I'm interested in getting your opinion on this front too.
Yes, certainly. It's absolutely vital for AI to have diversity amongst the people who are creating the algorithms, because otherwise those biases are internalized, as you well know. And some of the major problems that we're seeing in applications have come through that bias issue. How we set about getting more gender diversity into, or indeed any diversity into the engineering world is a more difficult problem. But maybe we can take heart. I'm a lawyer by background, and there are now, certainly in the UK, more women lawyers than there are men. Whereas when I first started, I'm not going to tell you how many years ago, it was very much the opposite. And likewise with doctors. So maybe we can look at how we encouraged women into professions that were hitherto male-dominated professions and use some of the learnings from those for the engineering professions. But one of the most difficult problems, I think, is that the technology is moving on so quickly and education is so slow that we are likely to see a lot more of these problems in the coming years because we can't train people, even if we could suddenly turn girls on to doing AI.
Certainly, it appears that we have a shortage, no matter how we try to cut it, of people coming out of top university programs skilled in building these types of systems. As a side note, I'd be very interested in seeing how the gender balance in law firms and in the medical profession changes as you go up the hierarchy. I wonder if in the top leadership positions, it's also true that women have managed to have the same breakthrough.
Yes, absolutely. I can tell you, of course, at the World Economic Forum Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution, there are more women heads of the various technology verticals than there are male.
Excellent. I think that's a great note to leave off on, because what it means is that certainly there can't be an argument that it's not possible. And therefore, anything that is possible, everything is possible, of course, but anything that is clearly possible and shown to be possible already in other contexts must be also possible in our context. So I look forward to that, not just creeping in, but avalanching into our profession over the coming years. And I also look forward to the artificial intelligence technologies as they're maturing, having a significant impact on the lives of billions around the world who definitely would benefit from the SDGs being pushed forward. So, Kay, thanks again really for your time today. And it was a fascinating conversation. I'm really glad that we had it, and I hope that we'll be able to continue the conversation, and hopefully we'll have a chance to also work together between our respective organizations in future on these themes. And I'll leave it there.
Certainly, that would be absolutely super, and thank you very much for your time. And yes, it would be wonderful to work together.